The lanterns in the grand hall burned with a polite, indifferent light that evening, their gold faces reflecting the careful smiles and sharpened expectations arrayed around the banquet table. Fine lacquered chairs creaked as guests shifted. The air tasted faintly of jasmine tea and the expensive perfume a woman had worn for the first engagement celebration of the autumn season. Between crystal and silk, alliances were being measured like coins. Ruan Li sat at the head of a smaller table, fingers white at the rim of her cup. Her mind counted obligations the way others counted breaths: one more toast, one more bow, one more name to remember. The jade pendant at her throat was cold and heavy against her collarbone, a small carved jade cicada the color of rainwater, threaded on a thin black cord. It had been given to her by a woman who had claimed kinship and kindness in the years before the company and the family tightened like machinery around her. Across the room, Bai Chen smiled as if the smile could anchor the room to his will. His suit was impeccable, the cut chosen for photographs. His hand found Ruan Li's mother's elbow with practiced tenderness. The engagement had been a strategic gesture. She, the virtuous daughter of a respected line; he, the even more respectable son of a partner family. Shen Mei, the matriarch who had dictated so many marriages and fortunes, sat in a place like a judge, all silver hair and calculating calm. Her fingers tapped a rhythm only she knew. That rhythm was a map to decisions made late at night. Xiao stood at the edge of the hall, on the far side of an entrance no one thought much of. He had come because he could not come. The old alley where he had grown up still spoke in him in a dialect of quick glances and practical instincts. He had never learned to wear the right jackets. He did not yet know how to fold a napkin into alliance. He had the wrong hands for the silver forks, the wrong shoulders for ceremonial bows. But when he stepped into that room, the pendant around Ruan Li's neck stopped him mid-breath with its familiar glaze, like a memory, like the echo of a name someone once called in his childhood. The dispute over inheritance had been a rumor for months, whispers that the family's legitimate line might not be so legitimate. Official channels moved slowly, private threats advanced like ants. The only thing faster than rumor was Shen Mei's will. She had a face that did not permit surprise. She made her moves the way seasons made their way, with finality and without apology. At the center of the chaos was an envelope whose edges had been softened by the palms of those who had already read and reread it. The paternity test result had been delivered to the family lawyer that morning. A fragile piece of paper, it said what would alter names, company shares, and the geometry of power. When it was announced that evening, the hall seemed to tilt. "May I?" the lawyer asked, voice low but carrying. Camera flashes exposed the room in stuttered bursts. A hush dropped like silk. Ruan Li felt something like vertigo. She had expected many things: an arranged contract, resigned love, public performance. She had not expected to see the color leave Bai Chen's cheek the way it did, or Zhao's face, standing in shadow, to click into a hard, concentrated thing. "The test confirms that the biological heir is Mr. Zhao Wen," the lawyer said. The name landed and scattered, voices like broken glass. A cup rattled. Someone laughed once, a high, brittle sound. Shen Mei's face, always composed, tightened as if a muscle had been pulled at the root. Zhao could have left then. He should have. He stepped forward instead, because standing was in his nature when the ground shifted. The attendees parted like reeds. He looked at Ruan Li, the jade at her throat a small green accusation, and he saw, for the first time without the smog of the street in his eyes, the way the light fell on her cheek. It was not only pity that steadied him, it was recognition, a thing older than speech. "Family," Shen Mei said. The single word had the force of a decree. There will be an inquiry. Protocol will be followed. Protocol, in Shen Mei's mouth, meant controlled narrative and delayed justice. It meant tests rerun in boards of men, laboratory seals, lawyers' signatures. It meant time that could be used to rewrite memory and to move vials. Outside, where the lanterns left the street thin and cold, a small man watched from a taxi. He had been the one who first recognized Zhao without needing a name. He wore the traces of a life that had learned to be unnoticed. Lo Yan made a note of the pendant and the way Zhao's hand tightened. He would put his network on quietly. He did not like family houses filled with light when they were ready to swallow someone whole. That night, after the guests had been filed into limousines and the servants had smoothed the linen like a second skin, Ruan Li returned to a suite that was her own by all accounts and by none. The pendant, cool against her collarbone, felt suddenly new, like a relic of something she had not yet learned. She thought of her mother's hands, the way they had smoothed her hair, and she thought of the text message she had not sent to Zhao earlier that week, the one that said only, "Are you all right?" A glass of chilled lychee wine was brought in by a maid. The maid's face was practiced. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to be peripheral. Ruan Li accepted the glass with a faint smile and a thought that was almost a prayer. May this night be the last misstep. She drank. Sleep pulled at the edges of her vision like a soft thing, promising escape. The suite smelled of sandalwood and burning oil. Behind the closed door, a quarrel thundered briefly, voices sharp and hushed, the low animal sound of decisions being made about a woman as if she were an object. Ruan Li's head tilted. Something warm in the glass tasted suddenly wrong. The world folded inward the way a fist folds a letter. She remembered at once the sensation of losing a thread, sound becoming water, the lamp's flame thinning as if dipped in oil. The jade at her throat felt unbearably heavy, an ancient weight. She thought of Zhao's hand, a hand that had steadied a cart in a rainstorm, a hand that once held a younger version of himself while promises were being made. The thought was a bright, clean ache. When the light went, she felt all at once as if she had been forgiven and accused in the same breath. In whatever small, fierce corridor between consciousness and surrender, she found a realization that was not yet language. She had been loved, and she had not seen it until the moment the world said no to her. She did not die long. The hospital corridor lightened at sunlight, the smell of antiseptic and coffee insisting on returning things to names. Doctors spoke in clipped syllables. A paramedic's fingers were patient and precise. There was an official report, a careful, shocking absence of the words anyone wanted to say. The hospital allowed her a private bed because she was a name the family could neither fully protect nor abandon. When she woke fully, the world had a new clarity and a terrifying distance. She learned that the maid had been dismissed, that the glass had been traced as possibly tampered, that Shen Mei went through the motions of concern with the confidence of a woman with everything to lose. Bai Chen visited with a face of fixed sorrow. His hand drifted near the jade but did not touch, because etiquette had replaced instinct. He spoke low, apologies folded into rehearsed kindness. Zhao came twice at odd hours, sometimes staying in the doorway where light pooled like a promise. He brought no flowers. He brought a battered thermos of soup, boiled for streets he had known and adapted to hospital proportions. His presence was steady. His fingers, when they brushed her wrist, did not ask permission. They simply anchored. "You shouldn't have come," Ruan Li said once, voice like a rusted hinge. "You shouldn't have woken up alone," Zhao answered. He did not offer a contract of rescue. He offered a truth as a handbreadth at a time. Recovery was a slow turning of a key.
She refused to be defined by the night she had nearly lost her life. That night had clarified something else. There were people who would move to silence the consequences of revelations. There were people who wanted to preserve a picture-perfect family at the expense of blood. Shen Mei's network had the kind of patience that chews through months. Lo Yan's network had a speed that chewed through nights. Ruan Li's recovery became an apprenticeship in decree. She would, in the weeks that followed, become reborn, not in some mystical shift of bones, but in a hard, practical remaking.
She began to speak in public with a new clarity, to refuse platitudes, and to watch faces closely as if memorizing topography. Shen Mei moved like storm water, patient, without flash. She sent emissaries, old friends with polite concern, lawyers with legalese, gentle reminders of propriety. She insisted on a second test, to quiet talk, the words of peace. But within the family, rotations of suspicion made names soar. The lawyer's office was soon a theater of sealed envelopes and rival copies. The lab, its technicians all uniforms and nerves, offered procedural delays. Shen Mei's plan was not to seize truth by force, but to make truth wait until it withered. Xiao listened to lawyers with a bored, private contempt. He did not belong in their vocabulary. He had been raised by alleys that taught that possession came by action and loyalty. He had also been raised by a hunger that had shown him that belonging could be a transaction. He could have walked away into the night, left the names and money to set like oil into water. He did not. That was not nobility. It was an insistence that someone who had been taken would not vanish again. Ruan Li watched him with a tenderness that no one offered explanation for. She found herself defending him in small, almost ridiculous ways, correcting a misremembered childhood detail at a family dinner, refusing to let a server brush him aside. Her interventions were small rebellions. They began to attract attention. The newspapers, which the family kept at a cautious distance from scandal, pulled at the thread. Social feeds pointed fingers as if the world were a moral factory. Shen Mei felt a blade of cold where her confidence used to rest. Then a leak happened. A lab sample vial, labeled and sitting in a courier's crate, disappeared overnight from the chain of custody. The signatory swore the crate had been sealed. The CCTV had a gap. The courier had been reassigned to graveyard runs. In such moments, conspirators act like chess players who forget that the audience is watching. They begin to move pieces faster, more rashly. In a smoky backroom of a club that smelled of stale whiskey and neon adrenaline, Lo Yan observed the leak and made a choice. He had once been called by names that suggested menace. Now he was called by those who needed something not sanctioned by law. For reasons that were part debt, part instinct, he resolved to help. His network found the vial not by forensic genius, but by a person who owed him a favor and remembered the Jade pendant. They found the vial because someone loose-lipped described a courier's limp and a scar on his elbow. The vial turned up in a box behind a bookshelf in a not quite unused office. It was, when examined in Lo Yan's modest private lab, swapped but not destroyed. The handwriting on the shipping form bore a flourish identical to the stationery Shen Mei favored.
When Ruan Li saw the vial, when she understood that someone had tried to move the truth like a pawn, her chest thrummed with an anger both private and potent. She felt reborn in anger as much as in gratitude. The near death had left her skin tender and her decisions sharp. She resolved to find the corners where the family hid things and to drag light into them. The conspiracy, once glimpsed, unraveled quickly in a way that was not swift enough. Shen Mei had not counted on Lo Yan's doggedness or on Ruan Li's stubbornness. She had counted on time and on everyone involved forgetting or being paid to forget. The evidence trail that mattered was not technical instruction, but human motive. The maid who had been dismissed and had gone quietly to a shelter.
The driver who had found a lab slip in an ashtray that did not belong in his car. The solicitor with an old debt to pay who refused to be bought clean. These small human debts, accumulated, shifted the axis of power. Bai Chen found himself in a room with choices. Would he align with the matriarch who had raised and polished him, or would he listen to the woman whose hand he had been promised? He had ambition in the shape of a spine, erect and brittle. He had complicity in the shape of survival. When confronted with the idea that his family's future could be cut from beneath him by a man he had never met, his reaction was a careful panic. He sought to choose the side that offered continuity. In private, his voice softened when Ruan Li spoke. He wanted to be the kind of man who would shelter and not bulldoze. But when offered easy comfort by Shen Mei's counsel, a future with no awkwardness over paternity or media, he swallowed and told himself he would be wise. The black market threads that trailed Zhao's life were not simply criminal. They were social contracts made in the shadow of survival. Lo Yan, who had once trafficked small things for a kosher living, now offered Zhao an uneasy alliance, muscle and knowledge in exchange for loyalty and the promise that debt would be repaid. Zhao's answer was not monetary. It was that he would protect the people who had protected him. When Ruan Li's name was dragged into public mud because of rumors of a scandalous engagement and a vulnerable bride, Zhao's anger lost its street aim and pointed at the family table. "You put yourself in front like you're saving someone," Ruan Li said to him in the quiet of the hospital garden. "Why?" "Because you're not for sale," he said, quiet as a sluice. "Because if they use you as a pawn, they'll move to the next piece." Those words knit between them a new pledge. She had been reborn into vigilance, he had been given a cause that did not fit the tidy categories of his life. Their alliance moved from accidental to intentional. They began to plan, not for violence, but for exposure. They gathered allies in awkward places.
A junior lawyer with a conscience kept records of Chen's communications. The dismissed maid offered a statement about being handed a glass and being told to leave. The courier remembered a man with a specific perfume. These things were not proofs in the technical sense, but they were narratives that could tether the truth to faces. The media, hungry for scandal, took one small leak and turned it into a chorus. Shen Mei's control slipped like varnish in weather. Small cracks, then larger flakes. It was at the company's autumn banquet, the event where business and marriage deals were often sealed in the same handshake, that everything tipped toward revelation. The hall was a stage with its own expectations. The board had agreed, under the pressure of exposure, to invite an independent forensic auditor. The auditor would speak. The test results would be re-announced, or at least the process would be explained. Shen Mei, for all her composed cruelty, could not shelter forever. On the evening of the banquet, crystal lights flickered like judgments. Ruan Li wore the jade pendant tucked beneath her dress, a heart now rather than a decoration. Zhao arrived with no formal invitation, but with a presence that cut the space in half. His coat smelled faintly of overboiled tea and rain. He stood near the back, watchful as a guardian. Shen Mei took the stage with all the ease of a practiced ruler. She opened her hands to the room as if to emphasize her own vulnerability, and that gesture was a kind of weapon. She began to speak of tradition and the family's duty to its shareholders. Midway through, the auditor rose and asked for silence. The click of a recording device was the only sound that mattered then. The room felt like a held breath. The auditor methodically outlined the test's chain of custody and presented results. The first slide showed a timeline. The second showed custody logs. The third displayed a photograph of the vial as it had been found in the bookshelf. When she said plainly and without flourish, "The sample has been tampered with," a sound like an animal's gasp moved through the crowd. Shen Mei's face remained a mask, but her fingers were no longer steady. "You must understand," the matriarch said, once the room cleared into a more personal dimension, "these accusations have costs." "There is a difference between cost and crime," Xiao replied.
The room spun, not because he spoke loudly, but because he spoke with the kind of certainty that belongs to someone who has known hunger. He named facts, small and human: the maid's statement, the courier's memory, the solicitor's regret. He did not rant about betrayal. He presented it like a ledger. Ruan Li, who had watched the small pieces come together like tiles in a mosaic, stood and took a step forward. "This family has many names," she said, and for the first time her voice did not tremble. "But a name does not make a man. A man is what he does." Shen Mei's defenses hardened.
"You are playing with reputations," she said, as if to accuse Ruan Li of throwing stones in a glass garden. "I am not playing," Ruan Li answered. She reached down and, with a movement that felt like a small prayer, withdrew the jade pendant and held it where the room could see. It gleamed faintly, a green stroke in the candlelight. "This belongs to my mother," she said, and the phrase set the room in motion. Shen Mei's lips parted, as if to say that she knew, then closed. A whisper. "Your mother?" People leaned in. The family history, long smoothed into acceptable stories, shivered. At that moment, a commotion stirred in the doorway. Someone's jacket snagged, a camera lens tilted. There was a soft sound like a chair tipping. Then a man in a suit lunged toward the buffet table. The room's attention snapped to the action. In that second, the auditor's laptop flashed a file that had been sent last minute, a recording. It was not perfect. There was scratching interference, but the voice was unmistakable. A man's voice with the timbre of a call made in urgency, arranging for a sample to be moved. Shen Mei's face, until then a sculpture of control, cracked. For the first time, the audience saw the exact moment a matriarch realized the terrain under her feet was not solid. The cameras closed in, phones lifted like a field of tiny suns. "You've been criminal in your intentions," the lawyer said later, in an exchange that had the brittle calm of an executioner reading a list. "Tampering with evidence, coercion, these are matters for the authorities." Shen Mei stepped back into the aegis of old power, but the world had shifted. The police were summoned, statements were taken. The banquet, once an emblem of alliances, dissolved into paperwork and polite resolutions. In the confusion, someone slipped a note into Zhao's palm. "Your people are waiting." The black market men moved that night with the speed of those who have always lived by their own rules. They did not come to harm. They came to ensure the family could not use the violence of the night to cover their misdeeds with another night's forgetfulness. Lo Yan and his people lingered at the periphery, a moral fog. They were not judges. They were stewards of a loyalty born of debt and rough gratitude. When officers with paper badges arrived, Vasco, one of Lo Yan's men, stepped forward and offered a witness statement about a courier's van in the alley behind Shen Mei's estate, a fact he had happened upon because he made the habit of knowing who left and who arrived in that district. It was small, procedural aid, useful, not noble. The legal aftermath moved at its own pace, slow as bureaucracy, but sharp as denunciation. Shen Mei called for attorneys and for meetings in offices where glass towers looked down on the city like indifferent gods. She attempted to bargain, to smooth, to call the matter a misunderstanding. She suggested private arbitration, quiet settlements. Time, again, was her weapon. But the nights had shifted. Ruan Li, who had first-hand knowledge of being nearly silenced, was no longer willing to bargain. She had felt, in the dark of the hospital corridor, the shape of love in the smallest kindnesses. Love, she had realized, had been present in the hands that had stayed and the eyes that did not look away. She had been reborn into the space between survival and defiance. To protect Shao was suddenly natural.
To stand by him in public was like putting on skin that fit. Their closeness rippled in ways the family could not contain. Bai Chen found that his neat world had an irrepressible leak. He loved Ruan Li in a manner that was equal parts duty and quiet rebellion. That confusion softened his stance, not enough to make him heroic, but enough to make him human. He stepped back, poorly, then stepped forward with offers of protection that were more image than truth. Shao watched these offers with a practical eye. He accepted what helped and rejected the rest. Shen Mei, when cornered, revealed a final, wilder stratagem. She hired, quietly and expensively, security that had a reputation for removing things that made problems inconvenient: witnesses, incriminating items, inconvenient journalists. In a hotel room, a reporter who had come too close found that his source dried up and his recordings corrupted. A witness recanted under pressure that was a mixture of threat and subtle debts. The family was not innocent of using hard measures to smother consequences. Shao, who had been on the fringes of having to choose violence as a solution, made a different choice. He worked with the junior lawyer who had conscience and the dismissed maid who had resolve. Together, with Lo Yan's modest resources, they collected not only documents, but people. The power of witnesses was not merely in what they said, but who they were. The chauffeur who had paid the couriers overtime, the lab tech who had been bullied into silence, the housekeeper who could recall uniforms and scents. Truth in their network was messy, human, and irreversible. The crucial moment came not in a courtroom, but at midnight in a small, underlit office where Shen Mei had stashed contracts and promises. A box toppled. A photograph slid. In a scene thick with breath and with the smell of old paper, the solicitor who had once been willing to sign compromises found himself with papers that had names in his own handwriting. Conscience and fear pressed against his throat. He called a junior counsel who had once loved fairness. They together walked into a police station at dawn. When the arrests finally came, they were methodical and not theatrical. Handcuffs in a lobby, a matriarch's face a restive mask. Shen Mei maintained an air of wronged dignity even as she was led in. The cameras loved the contradiction. In the press photos that followed, there were angles that made guilt look like tragedy. The aftermath was a new geography.
Company shares were reallocated, interim management installed, apologies issued like thin gauze. There was a sense of wound and a sense of an operation concluded. But in the open spaces left by power shifted, there were always new questions. Ruan Li and Shao walked through a liminal city in the weeks that followed, a city that smelled of rain and newly printed letters. They had both been remade, him by his name restored, her by the knowledge that she had been loved in ways she had not seen until she almost lost herself. The jade pendant lay now on a small velvet cushion on Ruan Li's dresser. She could have returned it to its case, but instead looped it on Shao's rough hand when he came to visit. "You keep it," she said. "You are the one who needs to remember the past you didn't choose." "No," he said, placing it over the cord around his own neck with fingers that had learned ceremony from street corners. "We both remember." Their intimacy was not a sudden rush. It was a cautious building of small things. A shared bowl of rice, a hand on a sleeve during a press conference, the way Shao would answer a phone call in the night with a voice that made no apology for its bluntness. Ruan Li learned to read the micro-expressions he could not hide. The micro-twitch when he was wary, the slow breathing that meant he was letting go of the night. She guarded him not because the world could not take care of him now, but because she had understood the cost of being unprotected and the value of being chosen. Yet the story was not closed. In the quiet left by arrests and hearings, new pressures came. Old friends of Shen Mei's whispered about lawsuits, about methods of attrition. A rival company watched openings and smiled with the thin lips of predators. The black market did not vanish with reasoned arrests, it simply repositioned. Lo Yan sent messages in the form of simple gestures. A man with a scar came to watch Shao's place one night and left without a word.
The underworld pays back in strange currencies. And Ruan Li, who had once been promised to another in the cool calculus of alliance, found that what she had realized in the thin corridor of near death shaped her actions as much as the law did. She had seen the real face of love in the small things, the soup Xiao insisted on bringing, the hand that had steadied rather than commanded, and that revelation made her fierce. If she had been reborn, it was now in the guardianship she accepted with a softness that stunned even herself. On a morning when rain came like a curtain drawn across the city, Ruan Li received a bouquet from an anonymous hand. The paper was the kind that shopkeepers used to wrap flowers quickly. No card, no signature. But inside was a small note. Stay close. The jade pendant at her throat felt warm, as though it had absorbed the touch of too many palms. She slid her fingers across it and thought of the night she almost closed, and the hands that had kept it from being final.
Zhao came to the balcony later, his breath misting like a question. He had the tired look of someone who had been energized by truth and then exhausted by the consequences. He said nothing. He simply stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You saved me," he said finally. His voice was both a confession and a ledger. "You saved me too," she answered. "After I nearly died, I realized I had been loved in ways I hadn't seen. That realization is why I live now, to protect what cost us both so much." He turned, and for the first time, his expression softened into a smile that was not for the cameras. It was for the quiet room where two people kept vigil for each other. For a while, there was no need to name what this would be. Guard duty could be literal and legal. It could also be a promise, spoken quietly over bowls of rice. Yet even as they stood there, an envelope slid under Zhao's door with no return address. Inside were photographs of a stack of documents, new claims, old receipts, a man's signature that looked shaky with age. The war of names and documents was not ended. It had merely entered a new phase where silence was no longer a solution. Ruan Li folded the paper and felt the old, efficient ache of strategy begin to take shape in her chest. Reborn, she had taken on the role of protector, not by a declaration, but by the accumulation of small, intentional acts. Standing in light, speaking truth, refusing to bargain shame. The city outside continued its indifferent pulse, but inside the apartment they shared, two friends, two allies, perhaps someday lovers, prepared for the next turn. "Are you ready?" Zhao asked, not a question of strength, but of willingness. She touched the jade at her throat, as if feeling the presence of her mother through its cool surface. The pendant had become a symbol that did not fix identity, but affirmed it. "I am," she said, "because now I know what love looks like, and I will not let it be stolen again." They walked downstairs together, the rain soft on their coats, toward the places where truth could be told and witnesses could be found. There were more hearings to come, loose ends to tie, debts to repay, and perhaps, in time, forgiveness to negotiate. The world had not become fair overnight, but Ruan Li had been given a second chance, a rebirth measured not by mystic fanfare, but by a choice: to stand awake, to speak, and to hold a hand when the night tried to take the light. The jade pendant swung against her chest as they stepped into the street, the small, steady green of remembrance, and she felt, deep and simple, that after the night she had nearly lost, she finally knew she was loved. That knowledge did not make the future safe. It made it hers to defend. Outside, a taxi idled. A shadow watched from an alley. The papers in Zhao's hand were only the tip of a new tide. The city shifted its gaze, curious and impatient. For now, they had each other and the fragile, fierce promise that love, once recognized, could be armor. But promises invite challenge. In the days to come, there would be a summons from a court, a late-night call that would rattle them awake, and a whisper that the matriarch had allies who would not relent quietly. Ruan Li folded her umbrella and stepped forward. The air smelled of rain and possibility.
She had been reborn not to disappear, but to protect him. This, she understood now, was not a martyr's vow, but a pact forged of gratitude and courage. The city hummed around them, indifferent and magnificent. They moved through it together. The courthouse was a box of muted light and murmured authority, its steps still wet from the rain. People moved through the entrance with the practiced indifference of those who either had power or had learned to pretend they did. Ruan Li and Xiao kept close, their umbrellas folded like quiet weapons. The jade at her throat tapped once against her collarbone and then lay still. Each sound felt amplified in the soft, civic hush. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and coffee gone cold. The receptionist's smile was a practiced currency. The guards' faces were unreadable. A metal door clicked behind them, and for a moment Ruan Li felt the city narrow to the weight of the papers she had folded and the photographs that had arrived in the night. The envelope in Xiao's coat pocket crinkled when he adjusted his grip. They met with the attorney in a small, windowless room between waiting halls, a woman named May, whose face was all angles and decisive calm. She spread the photographs on the table like an offering. "They've filed every procedural motion they can find," May said. "Delay, challenge, oppose. Your evidence is sound, but the matriarch's council is practiced at turning time into obstacle. They want to outlast you." Ruan Li looked at the shaky signature again, a looping, hesitant scrawl that belonged to a man who had once trusted a system more readily than he did his own breath. Her fingers brushed the jade. "Then we don't give them time," she said. The words were simpler than she felt. They contained the kind of certainty that had nothing to do with naivety and everything to do with stubbornness. May's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "You understand what it means to make this public? They will try to unmake you. They will inquire into your past, into every calculation you've ever made. They will dig for shame until their hands grow filthy. Are you prepared for that?" Xiao's hand found hers under the table. It was a touch that said he would stand between her and whatever came. "We decided that already," he replied. "She will not be made small to soothe someone else's appetite." Outside the room, the corridor wore its own small dramas. Flurries of lawyers in gray, a grandmother clutching a handwritten petition, a man who kept checking a watch as if the hour could be punished for wandering. When the clerk called the case, a small crowd drifted toward the gallery. Reporters, curious neighbors, and a few who had made a profession of lingering where people fell apart. The hearing room smelled of varnish and nerves. Cameras waited in the corners, sleek and indifferent eyes that would later translate expressions into headlines. Ruan Li felt a prickle of performance anxiety that had nothing to do with acting. This was confession under fluorescent light. This was truth asked to be more than a private memory. She watched the matriarch enter then. The woman carried the room like a carefully draped cloak, impossible to see past, impossible to ignore. She was accompanied by other faces that had the same crisp certainty of people who had never had to explain their place. When the matriarch's eyes met Ruan Li's, there was for a fraction of a second something that might have been recognition, or only the practiced flick of a ruler accustomed to being obeyed. Ruan Li kept her gaze steady. She had been taught, in the night she nearly died, how to hold herself. There were costs to every posture. She had decided which ones she would pay. The judge took his seat, a plain man with a voice that suggested he had learned to carry consequence without sentiment. Objections were lodged like small ritual affronts. May moved through them with the surety of someone who had navigated storms and retained her teeth. Ruan Li's role in the room was not to fight, but to be seen, an instrument of testimony, a living ledger. Between filings and formalities, a hush grew as witnesses were called. The matriarch's council offered a parade of character witnesses, people whose names meant weight and whose testimonies were polished to a sheen. Each one stepped to the stand with a practiced affection for the matriarch's benevolence, for the steady hand that guided neighborhoods and businesses and wills. The hall swallowed their tributes politely. When Ruan Li's name was read, the room pivoted. A small, involuntary sound left her, less a breath than a tide recalibrating. She rose with a steadiness that surprised even her. The jade warmed against her breast, as if acknowledging the moment. She was sworn in. The oath tasted like an old, bitter medicine, necessary and disciplinary. The question came, not sharp but precise. "State your name, please." "Ruan Li," she said. The syllables fell into the room and settled. People rearranged the angle of their listening. They began with the basics, the paper trail, the dates. May's voice was steady at her shoulder. The defense tried to unravel the connections, to show gaps where a narrative could be pierced. But when Ruan Li spoke of the night she nearly closed, she did not dramatize. She recited moments, how the light had gone wrong, the exact sequence of doors she had tried, the presence of hands, not all of them friendly, and something in that plainness worked. It anchored the testimony in a human tone that papers could not mimic.
Between answers, she felt the room's attention like a hand measuring her. Photographs were held up, signatures compared. A witness, the defense offered, attempted to paint her as a tumultuous woman, prone to drama. Ruan Li acknowledged past faults without flinching. She had learned, painfully, that owning the small unpleasantries of one's life made it harder for others to empty you out. Outside, the storm that had begun as rain shifted into a wind that rattled the windows. At one point, Zhao's grip on her hand tightened, not in warning, but in steadiness. It anchored her to something that was not the courtroom's ledger. She felt, in that simple pressure, the thread of the promise they had made on the balcony. Then, in the middle of a procedural exchange, Zhao's phone buzzed, soft and obscene in that place of elevation. He tried to ignore it. The device buzzed again and again, a persistence that finally forced his hand. He stepped out into the corridor, and for a breath, Ruan Li continued to answer questions, the words moving through her like beads on a string. She did not know if she would ever regret the clarity of what she had revealed. The risk and the remedy had become coiled together. When he returned, his face had altered. It had the quiet, charged look of someone who had received bad news and then chosen not to let despair have its voice. In his hand, he carried a small, folded slip of paper, one of those pale things that seemed designed to say little and mean everything. "What is it?" Ruan Li asked when the judge permitted a short recess. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was angular and hurried, unlike the matriarch's careful script. It read, "We can make this stop. Meet at the old market. Midnight. Come alone." The invitation was not a threat stated plainly. It was a danger with manners. It assumed fear and offered a bargain. 1,000 people in the city must live by negotiating their fears into bargains. The note whispered to Ruan Li that the matriarch's allies would not be content to use only lawyers and witnesses. They would reach into shadows. "You don't have to go," Zhao said. The plea was small and fierce. He knew, with the intuition of a man who loved her, that her choice would be the one least safe but truest to who she had become. Ruan Li folded the paper along its creases. The jade at her throat hummed like a small living bell. "If they want me to come alone, they're asking for secrecy," she replied. "Secrecy is what let them steal so much. I'm not interested in their bargains." That night, she set her phone aside and slept with the window cracked. Rain whispered against glass and thought. In the corner of her mind, the memory of the near darkness returned, not as a single terror, but as an accumulation of small holds. Hands that would not let go, voices that told her she was less than she was. She touched the jade and felt the cool comfort of a mother's steady presence, and the city sounded less like an indifferent machine and more like a body she knew how to navigate. Midnight at the old market smelled of damp spice and rotting fruit. Stalls were shuttered except where a few vendors lingered, packing their lives into sacks and lanterns. Ruan Li walked with purpose. She had left Zhao at the doorway, insisting he wait where light still lay. She moved through alleys like someone tracing a memory rather than seeking a bargain. A figure waited beneath the broken awning of a stall that once sold porcelain. When the stranger stepped forward, the face was not unknown. It was a face that lived in the margins of Ruan Li's history, a ledger of favors and debts. Wei, a clerk who years before had filed papers for a court that had once failed her. He had the thin, watchful look of someone who kept his loyalties carefully stowed. "They said meet alone," Wei said, without preamble. His voice carried the small justice of someone who had been trying to do the right thing while the world insisted on complication. "I couldn't risk it. I brought copies." He pushed a small packet across the wooden ledge. More photographs. A ledger with entries in 2 hands, a scrap of correspondence from a branch of the matriarch's network that suggested transactions in favors and obfuscation. Ruan Li's fingers trembled as she took them. The night smelled of wet cardboard and possibility. Wei kept his gaze on hers as if measuring whether she would be ruined or redeemed by the new evidence. "Why help me now?" she asked. The question hung between them, simple and enormous. Wei's answer was small and private. "Because some deaths are not owed to the law," he said. "They are owed to the people who still remember." He looked away as if embarrassed by his own courage. They were not safe. No one was safe when the matriarch ruled by network and silence. But the packets in Ruan Li's hands were a kind of ammunition. They promised aldermen and ledgers that could not be so easily erased. When she returned to the apartment before dawn, Xiao was awake, waiting with cups of green tea to warm their hands. He did not ask whether she had gone. His presence was enough. She poured the tea and set the new evidence on the table where the first envelopes had lain like small revolutions. They sat quietly, the quiet between them full of stratagems and shared risk. The city outside began to breathe into day. The hearing would resume. The matriarch would not relent. But the packet on the table had weight, and weight meant leverage. Ruan Li touched the jade at her throat. It felt familiar and unyielding. "We keep going," she said. "We tell the truth, and we hold the line for each other." Xiao's hand found hers again, the simple clasp of 2 people who had chosen to be shields. "Then we make them listen," he said. They walked into the morning together, the city watching and not yet ready to judge. The courtroom doors opened and the day began anew. And when Ruan Li rose to complete her testimony, the gallery quieted as if the whole room were leaning toward a single human voice. At that moment, a court officer at the back of the room passed a note to the matriarch's counsel and then moved toward the judge with a look that suggested urgent papers, something that would change the order of the day. The judge's expression tightened as he read. A murmur moved like a small current through the benches. Ruan Li steadied herself. She could feel the shape of the city's attention pressing like a hand at her back. She had come to tell the truth. The truth had teeth. Whether those teeth would be used to wound or to free was the next thing to be revealed. The judge folded the paper as if closing a small wound. The murmur in the courtroom gathered shape and then fell away like breath held too long. Counsel for the matriarch looked at the judge with a face that had never been taught the language of surprise. "This is a certified hold from the Central Investigations Office," the judge said, voice steady though his hand betrayed a slight tremor. "An order to preserve any documents or ledgers connected to the matriarch's network and to place under temporary custody any individual named in the accompanying affidavit pending inquiry." The matriarch's counsel reached for the note as if to snatch a child's toy, lips moving in a practiced cadence of denial. "Your Honor, we contest the jurisdiction." "Approach the bench," the judge interrupted. He did not look to the gallery for permission. The court officer who had borne the note took a step forward and flatly stated, "We received it 10 minutes ago, sir. A courier from Central. It comes with a seal."
Wei's packet sat on the prosecutor's table, a neat stack of paper that had been waiting like an unlit fuse. Eyes in the gallery flicked to it as if it might ignite. Ruan Li, standing in the witness box, felt the jade at her throat thrum with something that was almost prayer and almost fear. She had rehearsed every word. Now there was a new instrument in the hands of the city's machinery, and she did not know whether it would play a reveille or a requiem. The judge's clerk rifled through the documents, then glanced at the bailiff, who made as if to move. The matriarch did not rise. She sat with the serene attention of someone accustomed to being watched and found, rarely, admired. Her fingers toyed with the edge of a handkerchief embroidered with a flourish of gold thread. There was no panic in her face. There was a map of consequences that she had already memorized. "You will remain in the witness box," the judge said to Ruan Li. "Do not speak of anything outside your testimony. Counsel for the defense may set the record on any objections after I read the order." He tapped the seal with the tip of his pen, a small final action.
"In the meantime, the court will to preserve evidence." The matriarch's counsel sprang from his chair. "Your Honor, if this is a clerical stunt—" "It is not a stunt," the judge replied. "It is an administrative order. The court will comply." He folded the page and placed it within reach of the clerk. "However, unless further instructions arrive, this hearing will continue on the specific matter of the testimony already in progress." The matriarch's counsel bowed his head in thin victory. "As the court pleases," he said. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had argued long before his words were strained. Ruan Li's heart thudded somewhere near her throat. The gallery, which had been a static mass of faces, began to move in small waves, an exhalation of hope, of fear, of curiosity. Zhao's hand tightened on hers as if to remind the world that they were bound together. She thought of Wei under the broken awning, of the damp spice and the rotting fruit, of the ledger that had once been ledgers whose margins were notes in a language meant to be secret. Everything had converged into this small, bright point. "Proceed," the prosecutor said at last. He leaned forward and set Wei's packet on the table, as if it were an offering. The bailiff approached with a clerk who carried an evidence form. The clerk's hand looked suddenly very small and very steady as he took the papers. He checked the seals, compared names, then tapped the court log to record the transfer. The action was ordinary, bureaucratic. Ordinary things had a way of snapping brittle conspiracies in half. The matriarch's counsel rose to object. "My learned friend," he began, "we cannot accept late submitted evidence. This has not been vetted by my office." "It is not late," the prosecutor replied. "It was accepted by the court through proper channels." "You are attempting to admit hearsay," the matriarch's counsel said, turning to the judge. He was loud now, the clap of his outrage intended to drown a truth that had teeth. A voice cut through him. It belonged to a woman in the gallery, a quiet thing, with a face that might have been kind in another life. "She is my sister," the woman said, standing. She spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed nothing. "My name is May, and I worked in the matriarch's house for years. I can confirm the handwriting." Her presence was like a lamp lifted into a dark room. Faces turned toward her, and the matriarch's counsel inhaled as if to strike. "Call her," the prosecutor said without hesitation. He was no longer merely a man with legal training. He was a man who smelled the wind and moved to ride it. "We call May to the stand." The matriarch's counsel protested, then, as if sensing the changing architecture of the courtroom, signaled to someone at his table. Two women in black robes and quiet demeanor rose and moved toward the gallery, but the judge held up a hand. "There will be order," he said. "May, will you swear to tell the truth?" "Yes," she answered. Her voice was thin but steady. "I swear." She climbed the stand with the deliberate modesty of someone returning to a stage she had been taught to fear. On the stand, she looked small, like a single candle in a high hall. She spoke in fragments at first, days, tasks, names, but with each syllable, the ledger on the prosecutor's table seemed less like paper and more like a map carved in bone. She identified a signature, traced a habit of folding receipts, described a place in the matriarch's house where gifts were kept and where ledger pages had been burned, and where favors had been promised with the casual cruelty of a woman buying bread. The courtroom listened the way people listen to thunder. The matriarch's expression did not change. At most, she allowed a slight tightening of the lips that suggested the crossing of a final barrier, that she had always known the cost of her empire and now watched it pay itself. When May finished, Wei rose. He had been invisible until then, a clerk who had once filed papers for a court that had failed Ruan Li. Now he approached the stand and offered to authenticate the packet, how he had obtained it, the chain of custody he had walked, the risk he had taken. He told the truth in small, exact sentences. There was no flourish, only confession and thin, practical courage. "You were afraid?" the matriarch's counsel asked, voice low but sharp. "Afraid of the consequences?" "We all are afraid," Wei said, "but fear is not proof." The judge studied Wei for a long moment. "The court will receive this packet into evidence," he said. "Subject to later motion, it may form part of the record." His hammer did not fall, but the declaration itself felt like a hand striking metal. It made things real. A murmur swept like a wind. Some cried out. Some began to weep softly. Ruan Li sat back down, the jade cool as ice against her skin. Her throat was raw where words had been cut, where honesty had been carved. Outside the courtroom, the city would not yet know how the day had shifted, but inside the room, a small constellation had been remade. The matriarch did not rise immediately. She had a manner of gathering her defenses into her lap, like a woman gathering a child. When she finally spoke, it was with the same measured voice she used at charity dinners and festivals, the soft tone of someone who expected obedience without violence. "Is this how you plan to bring ruin?" she asked, addressing Ruan Li but looking at the room as if she were reading a script. "By dragging names across parchment? By selling my household to strangers?" "You bound hands and mouths," Ruan Li said. Her voice shook, the words were teeth, and she used them. "You made debts of lives. I will not let that stand." The matriarch smiled then, and for the first time it was not a cruelty, but something that had been used like a tool. "You think the law is a blade you can brandish and it will not cut you," she said. "You do not know what happens when the blade is sharpened by angry men." There was truth in her words, and the room understood it. Power had teeth that could bite both ways. Even with ledgers and seals and witnesses, networks bled outward like roots, and someone, somewhere, might choose to water them. Outside, the courthouse doors opened. A press of faces. The city's ordinary human hunger for spectacle pressed against the glass. Ruan Li felt the light change through the windows, felt the city's breath again. She also felt, beneath that, the small certainty of danger. The matriarch's word was a seed in soil, and wherever planted, it would yield. The judge called the court into recess for an hour to allow for verification of the documents. The phrase verification was a gentle thing for a task that tasted of war. The bailiffs moved like people reopening a wound cauterized only by will. The mat machine of the court would take time, and time was both ally and enemy. As the gallery emptied, the matriarch rose. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace and passed close enough to Ruan Li that their shoulders almost touched.
For a heartbeat, the matriarch looked at her. She whispered something that could not be heard beyond the two of them. Ruan Li did not flinch. "I will stand," she said aloud, "to the room, to the city, to herself, even if it means we lose everything." The matriarch's eyes glittered. "Then you will teach the world how to bury a good cause," she returned, low and certain. Her men closed around her like a ring of iron. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the crowd had taken a new shape. Voices rose, some in praise, some in resentment, many in wanting. Someone called the matriarch a thief. Someone else called Ruan Li a traitor. Cameras, small mechanical boxes that could render a face forever, blinked hungrily, and the city's appetite for accusation made a thin, metallic sound. Xiao guided Ruan Li through the press with practiced quiet. He kept a hand on her back as if steering a skittish horse. Wei walked with them for a few paces, then stopped, watching the matriarch's carriage disappear into the waiting sedan. He turned and said to Ruan Li, low enough that only she could hear, "They will move their pieces. Expect a counterstrike. I have already sent copies of these to 3 different magistrates. Not all debts are repaid in silence." Ruan Li looked at him, then at Xiao, then at the courthouse-like sky, gray and resolute. She thought of the small kitchen where the Jade had first been warm, of mornings with tea, of nights when hands had been less gentle. She thought of May's face on the stand, the way it had shone with an unpracticed bravery, and she felt both the lightness of vindication and the weight of consequence.
"We keep going," she said again, a phrase that had the flint of a vow. "We tell the truth, and we hold the line for each other." Xiao nodded. "Then we make them listen," he answered. They descended the courthouse steps into a city that buzzed like a living argument. From alleys and doorways, shapes moved, friends, enemies, curious strangers who would one day stitch together memory from fragments. For now there was only motion and the knowledge that the next hours would define something larger than any single life. Wei lingered at the foot of the steps, then slipped his hand into his coat and drew out a small folded scrap of paper. He pressed it into Ruan Li's palm. Her fingers closed around it, felt the roughness of ink, the certainty of a note. "Keep this," he said. "It will tell you where to go if the court is not safe." She unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried, the words few. "Come to the ferry at dusk. Bring no more than the clothes on your back. Do not trust the men in gray." Ruan Li's breath caught. The matriarch's network had eyes everywhere, and Wei's little paper was a map to a different kind of congregation, one assembled in secret and bound by the same thin, stubborn thread that had brought her to the courthouse. It was not victory yet, it was a step into the dark. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into the lining of her coat, where the Jade nested against her heart. The city moved around them, and with each beat of its many pulses, she felt the old market's damp spice, the broken awning, the ledger's ink, and May's small, steady courage. The day had shifted. Somewhere in the matriarch's house, preparations were already underway. Somewhere else, in rooms lit by single lamps, other people were choosing sides. Ruan Li and Xiao stepped into the tide of faces, carrying the knowledge that truth had been set loose, and that set loose things had their own ferocity. As they turned to leave, Wei caught Ruan Li's eye once more. "Tonight," he said, and his voice was only a breath. "Be ready." She nodded. The Jade at her throat was cool and stubborn. She felt the city closing and opening like a hand, and knew that the next motion would decide more than the case alone. The ledgers had been placed on the table. The question now was, what would live when the flames were fanned? They walked away from the courthouse into the thin light, and the city watched them go.